And welcome to everyone who has joined us for this PDAB workshop. I would also like to welcome our two esteemed panelists, and we're very excited to be able to dig into this topic today. And just a reminder for everyone that this session is being recorded and that we do share the session afterwards. So you'll see it posted online and in social media through our website as well. So that people who can't attend currently will have an opportunity to come back and have a look at it. But it looks like we're getting a really good participation sign in. And so I expect we'll probably see some folks sign in as we get into the conversation. So I'm Michael Egang, and I'm the Executive Director at the Rare Access Action Project. We have been doing these PDAB workshops for just almost a year now. And we are going to be exploring today a little bit of reflection on 2024, some of the areas where we've been involved and active, the things that we've learned, some of our interactions with policymakers, what do we think worked and what didn't work, and then we'll be looking towards 2025 and looking at ways that we can increase engagement, raise patient awareness and involvement, and again, be able to educate policymakers on the impact of some of these policies on rare patients. I'm really excited today. We have a terrific panel, and it's really interesting how working in some of these coalitions, you meet some of the most interesting people who are passionate about their work and about, the policies. And so this is one of those panels where I'm really pleased to introduce to you again, Bridget Sarrett, who is the founder at Advocates for Compassionate Therapy Now. Bridget has been a panelist before. She's always also a member of the Rare Access Action Project's Patient Caucus. And so welcome, Bridget.
Thank
And
you.
Olivia Backhouse, who's an attorney with the AIMED Alliance. And I would like to welcome her as well. AIMED Alliance has been a partner and collaborator in PDAB. And as many of you know, AIMED Alliance is involved in so many additional access issues. And so we'd like to welcome Olivia as well.
Thank you, Mike.
So with that, we'll go ahead and jump into our discussion. And I'd really like to begin to look at, 2024, now that we're looking back, but we are also still involved with some regulatory issues that we'll talk about in a moment. And I know both of you have begun to reflect on the experience in 2024. And so I'd like to really start there. And then about halfway through our allotted time, we'll go ahead and kind of move into more of a prognostication on what we think we're going to need for 25. What are some of the key issues surrounding PDAB? And where do we think that we can enhance patient engagement? How can we reach out to communities that we haven't reached out to or been able to engage in the past? And where do we go in 2025 that might be slightly different than 24? And then, of course, we'll wrap up and adjourn for the day. So with that, Kelsey, if you want to run to the next slide. I just, as I always do, threw up some state activity slides because we do have a couple of things that are going on. And I wanted to spend a moment talking a little bit about our experience in Colorado. And Bridget, I know that you're very involved here and that there are some very important things coming up in Colorado. Would you like to share with us a little bit about where we're at in the process in Colorado, Bridget, and why it's so important for now, right now, for patients to be involved?
Absolutely. Currently, Colorado has reviewed 5 drugs. Of those 5, they found 3 unaffordable, and they're getting ready to create rulemaking so that they can impose an upper price limit or a UPL. It's incredibly important right now, more than ever, to have patients involved, because that's one of the biggest things lacking throughout this entire process is patient engagement and patient feedback. So we have, knocked heads a little bit with the board, but we've also worked with them on several other things. So hopefully we can get more patient engagement so that they listen to us and they actually address the concerns we have, like increased utilization management, formulary changes, and things like that. The UPL it's an experimental policy here, so we don't know what's going to happen on the tail end of this, and so we want to be sure that our voice is heard as much as we possibly can.
Bridget, that's super important. And I know that we talk about the importance of patient engagement, making sure that patients are engaged not only in the public sessions, but that they're reaching out to policymakers and sharing their experiences, their insights. And I'd like to ask you, there really has been some effort to, Colorado is kind of in a different spot than many of the other PDABs. And they're already looking back to go back and tweak their processes. How do you think that they're going to really deal with patient engagement moving forward as this continues to unfold in Colorado?
Well, we actually are, they're looking at those particular rules right now. And the way that they have in the rules that they're going to deal with patient engagement and patient feedback is they're going to open it up to anybody, even people who don't have these prescriptions, they're not on them, or maybe don't even have anything wrong with them, which in my opinion would water down the patient feedback rather than doing what we have suggested, which is reaching out to healthcare partners. We have two physicians that sit on the board, one that works with UC Health and the other that works with Denver Health. And so far, they've neglected to reach out to those partners so that they can engage providers and the providers can engage the patients that will be impacted most. So it's going to be interesting to see how these new rules are implemented.
Well, Bridget, that's an important point, and I know we've talked about it in the past. That often, as we go to these hearings and we go to these events, we find that there are a lot of people claiming to speak for patients, and often when they speak, they often come up with areas that they want to talk about, and it usually has to do with benefit design. My out-of-pocket copays are too high. I couldn't afford the catastrophic in Medicare Part D. All of these are really important issues, but they're not really have to do with the drug cost. They have to do with, as you just pointed out, the benefit design, how the plan wants to manage or have those products utilized. And that all reflects in terms of the policies that are set for the patients to access them. And is there copay in this tier or that tier, and those sorts of things. And so, when you kind of, as you mentioned, it being opened up to everyone, which in a sense is kind of a good thing to hear from everybody, but you have a lot of people who are not patients, who are sometimes portraying themselves as patients. And so that's been my experience in some of the forums and venues that I've been involved in. And Olivia, did you have some thoughts here as well in terms of process and patient voice?
Yes, I'll certainly underscore the power of incorporating the patient voice in these processes. I'm glad to see that the stakeholder engagement guide has been released to help inform stakeholders who might want to participate in this process, especially consumers who might find it difficult to keep track of all that's going on with these meetings, if they're changing dates or if they want to submit public comments, the deadlines for these. It's nice to have that information a bit more organized, because I think having a collective voice and the more patient representation, the better, just to really reiterate these points as we're trying to share our concerns when it comes to increased utilization that might result from Colorado's implementation of APL.
Terrific. Bridget, any other thoughts before we move into some other states and then reflecting more broadly?
I would hope that if we could get more patients to engage, that the board would acquiesce and not put the patient engagement burden on the actual patient and start to reach out to healthcare partners to departments of health, to the Colorado Department of Health and Human Services, and other different programs and resources that they have access to that maybe we don't as patients.
I think that's an important point. You know, when you said don't put the burden on the patient, put the burden on the program to find the right patients for the various, you know, products that they want to review, or, you know, for the areas that they're going to begin to explore. And I think that is an important distinction. I know in many of the states, you have RDACs, for example. And as we talk to RDAC members, they're often not even communicated with at all, let alone consulted. And we did find that in the initial phase of the Colorado PDAB. Again, they had this rich resource in terms of the RDAC that was just being formed in Colorado, and yet there was no connection with them.
Correct. Yes, hopefully that improves in the future. I know they do have to consult the RDAC now by law, but what that entails is very obscure. And so it could just be, oh, by the way, we're reviewing these drugs.
Right.
So it's not a mandate to actually sit down and talk with the RDAC extensively about what patients are concerned about, where they're finding the roadblocks, and how we can actually help improve costs for the patient.
And I think, Bridget, important to that is when you have a resource like an RDAC, if those patients that you're reviewing the drug for are not on the RDAC and represented, having that RDAC help you find that patient community and connect it with that patient community. Those are the experts, and honestly, the rare disease community is very interconnected, and utilizing them as a resource to find the right patients to comment, to talk about their patient journey, about their experience with a product. You know, the RDAC can be a resource, even if the right patient might not be impaneled on the RDAC at this point.
Correct.
So very, very important. Let's go ahead and Kelsey and go to the next slide. So there's a lot going on, and you know, I know that both of you have been very involved through the summer in terms of communication with policymakers and you know, speaking with folks in a number of states on PDAB. This summer, we've also been doing a lot of outreach and work, and it culminated a little bit in August when we were at the big NCSL conference. And we actually had some time to find delegates from Rhode Island, delegates from Maryland, from Illinois. I had a wonderful conversation with a gentleman in Illinois who was actually sponsoring and signed on to PDAB legislation in Illinois, and had a chat with him. And you know, it's interesting to me that when you have these opportunities, sometimes away from the pressure of the legislative session, to have those kind of conversations, let's say through the summer and into the fall, that you can have a very different conversation. I know, for example, with some of the members of the Rhode Island delegation who had signed on to PDAB in this session, they're having second thoughts about signing on to it in 2025 because the legislation was held over for study, because we were able to have a conversation with them. So just, you know, for both of you, how important has been the outreach outside of legislation or legislative session for you? And are you finding that there's a willingness to at least discuss not only the challenges with PDAB, but potential solutions?
So I've been working already in Colorado. I think it's critical for us to reach out before the legislative season begins in January. And we've already been having meetings with the current legislators and potential legislators about what's going on, the concerns that we have, the good things that we have seen as well. And we're getting mixed reviews here in Colorado. You know, some people are very open to discussing potential solutions and potential issues that could arise from the PDAB legislation as it stands right now. But then some people are not, and you find they are very heavily invested in their election. They want to be able to say that they've lowered costs, even though nothing has gone into place yet. Um, so it's kind of a mixed bag at this point. But reaching out is incredibly critical. They need to hear the stories of the constituents. They need to understand that we're watching this and we want to head off any potential problems that could happen. And we're very willing to work with them.
Olivia, I know that I was just going to kind of tee you up a little bit. I know the Aimed Alliance has been working on a number of communications pieces, as well as conversations with policymakers, and just wanted you to weigh in again on the importance of engaging outside of legislative sessions.
Certainly, I think we can lay the groundwork for the upcoming session by engaging in explaining some of these misunderstandings with how PDABs may function. I think on paper or when they're discussed in quick meetings, when they're simplified, they might sound like a great solution, because I think the intent behind a lot of them might be good and we want to save consumers money. I think that's something everyone can kind of get behind. But when you don't look at how UPL is defined, or how we're defining what's affordable, or the complexity of looking at and confusion of what consumer is paying at the counter versus the market price. And I think there's a bunch of complexities that it's so important before session to educate lawmakers and their staff on, so that way you can kind of hit the ground running moving forward. And I think explain not only some of those misunderstandings, but also tee up and explain alternative legislative solutions that could be pursued if the end goal is to save money for consumers.
I think that both of you hit a really important area in, during the legislative session, particularly with a bill like PDAB, it will get put on a leadership track, and it will become kind of that big piece of legislation that they can go and campaign on, that they can say, look, what I'm doing, I'm saving consumers money. Even though, Olivia, as you had mentioned, and Bridget, as you had mentioned as well, PDABs are largely experimental at this point, but the talking points are that, hey, I'm doing something. And, that was pretty similar to some conversations I've had through the summer, that when you don't have that kind of pressure on the legislator, they're a little bit more willing to open up and talk. We're having some conversations with actually some of the bill sponsors here in Virginia in the next few weeks, and they express a willingness to actually talk with us that they didn't express during the legislative session. And so, having the ability to call a legislator who might be home in their district, who you might run into at a soccer game, or at a community event, these are really important opportunities. I think that a lot of us don't necessarily have top of mind when we start thinking about, how do I change the legislation? Oh, I've got to get on the ground during legislative session. But we forget about all that community time and the time back home that we may have to actually have a discussion without all the pressures on the legislator.
Absolutely.
Bridget, have any other thoughts on that?
No, I think it's really critical for patients to look in their districts and see what events their state legislators or in the ones around them, not just theirs, are doing, because it's a great way to connect. And these people are in our communities. So you'll see them at restaurants, you'll see them at the movies, and it's an excellent time to connect with them.
I absolutely agree. I know during legislative session, they're stacked up with meeting after meeting every 15 minutes or so.
Yes.
And, it barely gives you time to introduce yourself, let alone talk about the complexity of a bill like a PDAB bill.
Yes.
That could change the course of someone's treatment. And so these are really important opportunities. And I think that that's an area that the community probably can do more, is to get these legislators outside of legislative sessions.
Yes.
Kelsey, could you go to the next slide, please? So I know, for example, in Virginia, like I said, we're going to be having some meetings with some of the sponsors actually. And again, because the PDAB bill in Virginia was on a leadership track, it was a must pass for, the Democrats who hold the majority in both houses of our legislature. And but what was interesting was the willingness to engage in conversations and then understanding that this may not be the right vehicle. Now, that might not have come up, and it didn't come up during legislative session, but there was a willingness to explore that it might not be the right vehicle. And please come in and talk to me. So, just a little bit of context around what we saw as well, which was very similar, Bridget, to your and Olivia's experiences earlier this year during the legislative sessions. I know that, when we were all supporting Senator Kirkmeyer in Colorado, and there was very much kind of a fault line between folks who supported, a rare disease carve out and those who felt that rare diseases are driving healthcare costs. Therefore, we have to, have PDAB review and do a UPL when appropriate. And it's sometimes getting out of the legislative session where the fault line kind of can get pushed to the background a little bit, and you can have a much more in-depth discussion. And I think that's really important for our communities to remember.
Absolutely.
Any other thoughts on the 2024 legislative session? Any other areas of key learnings that you had from the 24 legislative session before we kind of start looking into the 25 legislative session and how we can prepare for that?
No, I think I'm good.
Olivia, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I'd say one other highlight is just that Oregon pushing their drug reviews to next year. I think does highlight the power of, the collective voice and in reaching out to these boards and communicating with them our concerns, that it's nice to see that it's been acknowledged that it's not a concern just us as consumers, patient advocates are sharing, but the board itself is also expressing that concern, and they need to kind of use caution proceeding.
I think that's an important point, Olivia, is that, we have been successful in 24 because of that. And that's a really good example. The other one is in Maryland, where we had legislators, even during the legislative session. I was so impressed by both some of the staff and the legislators who were supporting PDAB about their willingness to engage with us during session and their willingness to explore it more in depth and open the door for us to come in. I certainly, and you guys can kind of weigh in here, I didn't expect that in Maryland because of my experiences in other states, where some of the legislators felt like PDAB was fully baked. They gotten all the feedback they needed, and this was a priority vote for them. Maryland really approached some of these things thoughtfully. Now, they may not go the direction we want them to go, but I was very impressed by the way they did respond to us as we advocated, testified, and then had conversations with both committee staff and members.
Absolutely, that's something definitely important to recognize.
Well, great.
Absolutely.
What's that, Bridget?
Oh, absolutely. I think it was really fantastic of Oregon to push these off when they started realizing they were having patient engagement issues. And they wanted to rectify that before really getting into these reviews. And finding legislators that are willing to engage with you is gold. Even if they don't do what we would like them to do, I love the fact that they're willing to engage.
That is something that at least allows us potentially to make a bad bill better. We may not be able to actually solve the issue of the PDAB, but we may be able to do some things to make sure that if they are going to proceed, that it is better than if we hadn't engaged.
Exactly.
So I think that's a terrific point, Bridget. So I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit, and I have a couple of questions I want to really have you talk about with us a little bit. And then with our audience, I really would appreciate if there's any questions or thoughts that you have. Please go ahead and put them in the chat. As you know, with our past workshops, both Kelsey and I monitor the chat, and we are happy to ask your questions to our panelists. And I am sure our panelists would love to engage with you. So please feel free to share those questions with us as well. Olivia, I want you to ask you a little bit about, how we can drill down into those things that you think really were the most effective, either from, the 24 legislative session or even prior, that helped frame patient interests during the legislative process. Are there specific tools? Are there key messages or components, things that you think that were important in kind of the previous effort that we need to think about as we move forward?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think using our collective patient voice is a great way, especially when it comes to education. I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding or confusion around how some of these bills might work, whether it's how we're defining a UPL and even just simplifying the drug supply chain, or in that we're going to see consumer savings for consumers. I think really breaking down the potential consequences that these boards might have is so critical to educate our lawmakers, and really break down the bill and look at how we're defining a UPL, in that it's a maximum reimbursement rate for payers. And if they do see savings, how can we know they're going to do anything with that, or and let consumers see a cost savings at the counter? So I think that we can propose modifying these bills, we can propose solutions, but I think so much of it comes from just kind of starting at square one and educating and looking at the function of the bill. I also think working together and partnering with other patients, with other patient advocacy groups, is another great way to really to share information. I think everything's moving so fast. At least some boards have slowed down, but some are kind of charging forward despite our hesitations and concerns. And it can be hard to stay up to date. As we mentioned earlier, the burden is on the patient at this point to engage and share their concerns. And so, like, the least we can do is at least kind of all team up together to at least share this information about how to participate in these meetings, or what are important comments to make, if what's being heard or not being heard, and the best methods. And so I think not only can we stay informed and at least reduce that burden on ourselves, but it also can amplify our voice if we come with a united front. And so I think as we continue to engage with board members and take any opportunities we see being presented, that I just think it's so important to educate, but also stay in contact with each other and kind of use all avenues to have a consistent communication with the board.
I want to follow up question, Olivia, and Bridget, you can jump in as well. You had mentioned that it's important to share with them the unintended consequences. And, in some of the states where we've weighed in, of course, when we share the consequences, and some of our thinking, because as you said, Olivia, this is the maximum that a payer can pay. And then there's a cascade of unintended consequences. And, we've been called shills of big pharma. We've been called, we're just saying what big pharma would want us to say. And yet there's really no discussion of those unintended consequences or understanding. I was with the patron of the bill here in Virginia, and she looked at me and she said, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that the drug payment and reimbursement system worked that way." So as you approach that, it's a kind of a two-part question. One is, how can you share that as a patient and help them understand that these types of payment nuances, how drugs get paid, And Olivia, as you said, that this is really a cap on a maximum payment that can be made by payers in your state and how that's going to affect patients. How can we do that in a way that gets that information across to them and then also is authentic to who we are as patients?
Yeah, sure. That's a great follow-up question. I think kind of starting square one is what is a UPL and really breaking that down and looking at the definition and where that cap is and kind of follow the drug supply chain and ask yourself, like, will consumers see that? Like today in the Washington PDAB had their meeting, and one of the board members had even mentioned as they were laying out considering which factors to consider as they're determining what drugs are eligible for review. One of the board members had expressed that concern and the need to consider patient out-of-pocket costs, because as the individual mentioned, there's no guarantee. There's nothing in the bill that if there were to be savings earlier on in the chain that consumers going to see any of that. And so it was nice to see that acknowledged, although other members seemed to also push back on that. And there was a bit of, I think, disagreement on how to approach it and what factors to consider and how to weigh them. But I think it's a really important conversation to really break it down to the fundamentals and then express that the state PDAB doesn't function just within the state, that there's going to be consequences or effects that expand outside the state. It doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the drug supply chain doesn't exist just within the state. And so by setting a UPL that might be that might impact Medicaid best price reimbursement rates, we're gonna see effects that cascade beyond the state that might pose consequences that might impose a rebate burden on manufacturers, that might have all these cascading effects that I don't think are being quite considered. And I think as a patient, it might be hard to break that down, but I think kind of starting at square one and looking at what a UPL is and how it functions is a good base to start.
Terrific. Bridget?
Absolutely, I would agree. With Colorado, it's been very difficult to have those discussions, and the focus has shifted over the 5 reviews that we've had from it's going to save patients money to now it's going to save money on premiums. And I think that's a very dangerous place to be, because they've set it up to where, an insurance company or someone can come back and say, well, we could have raised your premium $50, but we're only raising it $48 because, like you said, drug prices aren't in a vacuum, but they're also not the only contributors to high healthcare costs. I heard in the Senate hearing yesterday that hospitalizations actually are a major contributor to the rising cost of healthcare, and staying on the right medication could actually lower that significantly, and those things aren't even being counted. So our concern is trying to make them understand that not only could this impact access to the drug that they are reviewing, but it could impact the entire class of drugs along the way, including formulary changes. It could create more barriers to access, and it actually could not only increase prices, but it could increase disparities among healthcare for minorities, for people who are disabled and low-income folks. And so we're really concerned about that. And we're trying as best we can to get that across. But again, as you mentioned, a lot of our comments are just dismissed. We've brought these up for a year now, and we've been called fear mongers or pharmaceutical shills and things like that. And they're actually looking at patient feedback and seeing how they can dismiss it. They're even dismissing patients that aren't necessarily associated with pharmaceutical companies, but maybe were referred to or found by pharmaceutical companies. So it's like the, 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, the 6 degrees of pharmaceutical companies. So, I get concerned because I'm a patient. I don't take money from pharmaceutical companies, and maybe my neighbor works for a pharmaceutical company, or I have a friend that takes money from pharmaceutical companies. Is my feedback being dismissed? So that's been a real challenge in Colorado, and we're hoping that maybe we can fix this.
Yeah, I have seen it here in Virginia as excuse me, as well. Bridget. And you know, it's one of those things where, you know, when you lay out the facts, the only response back is that, oh, you're speaking for big pharma. Well,
Yes.
they're totally dismissing the facts and addressing the concerns that we might have around, you know, as Olivia said, you know, 340B pricing. Many rare diseases, particularly, for example, blood disorders, rely on 340B pricing. It helps fund patient services and care that patients need. It could impact state Medicaid budgets. And as you talked about, that would increase health disparities if you see a reduction in funds for Medicaid and the Medicaid program. And I was talking to some colleagues this summer, and they started talking to me about pharmacy deserts and how, you know, a UPL, if a pharmacy, particularly a rural pharmacy or a pharmacy in an area that doesn't have a lot of options, can't start carrying some of the therapeutics that are needed because of the UPL, and that would exacerbate basically a pharmacy desert for patients. And then,
Absolutely.
Bridget, as you just brought up, rare diseases sometimes doesn't fit in the normal kind of chronic care disease model that they're thinking about. You know, many of our rare patients actually travel outside the state to centers of excellence and where they get care. And at least currently, some of them also get their therapies out of state. So their therapy may be administered while they're getting care at a center of excellence. And of course, that could lead to brown bagging. That could lead to, you know, patients having to pay the difference between a UPL and then the price of the product that's procured out of state or
Yes.
supplied to them. So there's all sorts of nuances that I just think, because policymakers want to keep us all in this kind of chronic care model that's not rare, that they don't understand these nuances.
Correct.
Well, I do have a question, Bridget, because I think this is important for other states to consider. And that, you know, you have been a huge advocate that the PDAB needs to have a voting patient representative on the PDAB,
Yes.
that you really can't have an effective PDAB. And I think that's particularly acute as this generation of rare advocates are far more educated on therapeutics. They understand the clinical data. They understand the impact of access. And in many cases, some of these patients have been involved in the drug development process and working with FDA, and yet they're dismissed now when it comes time to talk about access. Can you tell me about not only why you're advocating for that, but also how are you framing your arguments, and what do you find that is helpful for you to move that discussion along about patients being impaneled?
Absolutely. That's a great question, because a lot of PDABs don't have patient representatives. They have physicians, pharmacies, hospital administrators, people who would never be in our situation to understand the specific nuances. In rare patients these days, we have to be incredibly knowledgeable about our conditions. We have to be knowledgeable about the medicines we're taking. We have to be knowledgeable about the insurance and how to get around those, you know, roadblocks and things like that. So we're very familiar with how all of this process works, and sometimes even more familiar than doctors. We're basically letting them know that while we absolutely appreciate the wealth of knowledge that's on the PDAB with the physicians and the pharmacists and the administrator, it still doesn't replace the patient voice. And a lot of times, what the physicians and everybody else think we want isn't necessarily what we want. The struggles they think we're having may not be the struggles that we're actually having. And you can't replace a patient voice with a physician. They cannot speak for our struggles. They can't speak for our journey. And a lot of times they're not as familiar with the rare diseases as they need to be just in itself. And so we could provide a wealth of knowledge for them, and also make sure that they understand that our concerns are not fear mongering, because you can't head off something if you don't discuss it. And so I think a patient would bring an amazing resource to the PDAB, and it does need to be a voting member.
I have something I wanted to follow up from what you said, Bridget, because this is an important point. And Olivia, you may have a thought here as well. You know, I've had experience in other therapeutic areas as well. And sometimes when you see the kind of the stakeholder research, and if you ask a physician about what are the key areas that are important to their patients, they will come up with a list. And then when you ask those same questions of the patients themselves, you have a very different list of key concerns. And I think this ties back to a little bit about what Olivia was talking about in terms of the flow of savings and what they think they're doing for patients, and how their messaging has had to change because they're not going to be able to meet the needs of patients. They're not going to be able to show patients those savings. And that's really where patients are looking at and saying, how can you save me money? And they're saying, well, we're going to attack the price of the drug, but it won't save you any money. So why do you think there's that disconnect between the board and patients in the marketplace then? Is it just because of the perspectives, and would a patient, voting representative really be able to help that?
I think that a patient representative would absolutely be able to help that, because the patient is the one person that is there from prescription pad to patient. And so they understand that pipeline better than anybody else. And while the physicians may know part of it, they generally don't know all of it, and they don't necessarily understand how it works. So I think a patient could bring up concerns that they might not have even thought about. And those are important because this is a very complicated pipeline when you talk about getting medications to a patient, especially when you're talking about rare disease medications that are very expensive. You know, there's a whole supply chain, and only looking with a very small lens at one portion of it and not understanding how it all works together could really lead to some very bad unintended consequences. And the patient representative should be able to help head some of those off and maybe bring up things that they haven't even thought of.
Yeah, and just to jump off that, it's the patient with the daily experiences of the treatment and the access barriers and managing the disease, and by including a member of the rare disease community with voting authority, it ensures that that voice is being prioritized in these discussions as they make these decisions that impact these patients. I think it's easy to, forget or minimize some of the potential consequences of these decisions when you're not living day in and day out managing these rare diseases and the potential consequences of losing or your access being restricted to your treatment.
I have a question from one of our participants, and it's a pretty specific question, so I'm going to ask it, and because I think it's on target. What happens if the one patient chosen is the patient consumer group from patient consumer groups that are funded by Arnold Ventures or the Commonwealth Fund? Would the criteria, Bridget, I appreciate the humor too. Would the criteria need to be included this as well as no affiliation with the industry?
Yes, that's actually a huge concern, especially considering that our PDAB board specifically seems to gravitate towards only wanting to hear certain feedback, only wanting to hear from certain patients. And almost at every single meeting, they will criticize the feedback that they're getting. And I understand not wanting feedback from people who have a financial stake in keeping the status quo. That I understand. But there's also a bias towards the PDAB and what it's going to do, and ignoring all of these potential unintended consequences. And that is a big fear, that the one patient that they choose is just going to be part of this echo chamber. And then they can finally say, oh, well, we have patients represented, when they actually don't. So I do feel that there has to be zero conflict of interest as far as that goes for a patient to be on there. Because either bias is going to create a very biased situation. It's gonna, lean towards one viewpoint or the other. And we want somebody who can actually talk about what we've gone through as we're patients, what is going to happen if we lose access to these therapies, and even be able to discuss things like how biosimilars are not actually the therapy, it's just similar to the therapy. And even that change in ingredients, if you have somebody, say, that has MCAS, it could be a very potentially harmful impact. So that's a huge concern.
Well, thank you, Bridget. I think that's really important. And I know in Colorado, you have a second layer of advice to the PDAB called the PDAC. And it's other states don't have even that. And I guess my question would be to both of you is, we have systems set up now or being set up by legislation, but by the viewpoint that we don't necessarily have to understand how the pharmaceutical ecosystem works from 3PL at the manufacturer through the distribution system, as Bridget said, to the script, to the patient and patient utilization. We don't need to understand any of the middle, and yet we can regulate it and find the place where a UPL should be set without that knowledge. And sometimes that knowledge will bring some bias because you need people experienced in that area. And sometimes you want people that are going to be fair and balanced, like patients or physicians that can look at, kind of some big picture things and bring in other issues. But it just seems to me that there might be one piece missing, and that's understanding of payment and reimbursement, of pharmaceutical distribution, of, even administration inside a hospital of a product, and what that means from a payment perspective, and why oral drugs are treated differently than infused drugs, and all of those nuances that you're not necessarily getting. So this is a very interesting discussion, and one I think that because of the complexity that PDABs need to understand.
Absolutely. I think they do need to understand it, and they are missing so much information that really is critical to this process, especially if the goal is to save the patient money. That's something that, yes, we would love to pay less for our prescriptions, but when you have so many inconsistencies, when you have so much misunderstanding about how all of this works, and you have either an echo chamber or, one way or the other without balanced feedback, you tend to get lost in that equation there.
I have just a final question for Olivia, if we could, because it comes back to that point, Bridget, is that we believe that there may be other solutions, and particularly as we're looking at 2025 and we're preparing to advocate, and we want to not just be the voice of no, we want to be the voice of solutions that can provide patient benefit. I mean, that's really our focus. And Olivia, I wonder if you could just take a moment to share with us some of your thoughts about how some of these alternative approaches can be utilized in terms of, addressing the cost issue for patients, and then leveraging that to improve patient access. Are there certain areas that you think need to be explored further, and what might some of those areas be?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I think when talking about all the problems that we're seeing with UPLs, it's nice to also look at other alternatives and see what we can do to make drugs more affordable. I think that's looking, when we hear that, especially when we hear the concern that the implementation of UPLs might lead to increased utilization management tactics, it's why don't we address those? That those are a timely and have a timely and direct impact on consumer cost sharing and affordability. One example is prior authorization, which can delay access to life-saving treatments, increase administrative burdens for physicians. And some states have passed guardrails, like imposing time requirements on prior authorization reviews, or prohibiting retrospective denials, or standardizing paperwork. That these policies do continue to delay. And more recently, we're seeing some states introduce gold card laws, which alleviate this burden on providers and allow patients to access their medications in a timely manner. Gold card laws exempt certain providers from the prior auth process if they've successfully received approvals for, it's like 80, 90, or 100, depending on the state, of their previous requests within the last 6 months. Another option is a step therapy guardrails. Step therapy, also known as fail first, requires that patients try and fail on alternative treatments before insurance will cover the prescribed treatment. And without these guardrails, step therapy protocols might require patients to try and fail on alternative treatments, multiple treatments, treatments they previously failed on. And these practices can increase costs for the healthcare system and patients long-term. And several states have enacted step therapy exemptions, but many can and should do more. And examples include like prohibiting trying and failing on more than one medication, prohibiting trying and failing on off-label medications, or setting timelines like 30 days for how long a patient can be required to try and fail on these alternative medications. Another is a ban on copay accumulators, which exclude the value of third-party assistance from counting towards a health plan's deductible or a maximum out-of-pocket limit. So states can reduce this financial burden on patients that they're stuck having to either skip their medication or ration it when they run out of this assistance. And lastly, is PBMs are operating with limited transparency. It makes it difficult for us to understand pricing and fee distribution. So we can, with increased regulation, enhance transparency, we can prevent conflicts of interest and ensure consumers benefit from negotiated rebates. And so these alternatives at least offer a more timely and direct impact on consumer affordability, as opposed to pursuing PDABs that are, have significant upfront costs that are entirely experimental and have no guaranteed savings, especially that would reach a consumer.
Well, thank you, Olivia. I think that was a wonderful kind of note for us to transition into wrapping up. And I apologize, we're a little over time, but I think this was a valuable discussion. And, the seeking of these solutions that can be offered in good faith as part of the discussion is critical for us to be prepared as we move into 2025. I know at RAAP, we're doing a lot of work this fall. We have our big state strategic session next week, where we are going to be exploring some of the solutions that we might offer next year. Rather than just going in and saying no, saying, how about we work on these areas that can put immediate benefit back in patients' pockets, that we can mitigate the cost to patients and yet continue to encourage access and encourage, physicians to use appropriate therapies that are needed during the patient journey. So we have some of that work that's going on this fall. And then just so folks know, we are beginning our pre-2025 legislative sessions in October. And so we will be in a number of states having meetings with policymakers, beginning to lay some of the groundwork, meeting with proponents of the bills as well as opponents of the bills, and trying to see if we can find areas that we can work together that put the patient at the forefront and in the winner's circle rather than political interests. So there's a lot that is ramping up. And I know we have some of our partners who are actually in the attendees section of the call, who are also working on some of these issues. And Bridget, I know that you're going to be pounding the pavement and doing the same thing, and we appreciate all your efforts, and also our colleagues at Aimed Alliance. We will be having some links to some of our partners on the RAAP website. Aimed Alliance and some of our other partners like Arthritis and others have some really wonderful advocacy materials. RAAP, we are wrapping up our Q&A and our one-pager on PDAB, and really are focusing heavily on the rare patient journey and the impact of PDAB on the rare patient ecosystem that's around them to supply them therapeutics and healthcare. And so, you know, we may find that each of our groups has a slightly different take on it, and that's okay, because we each are looking at it through the lens of our patients and through the lens of how we need to interact in the marketplace. And that's slightly different for many therapeutic areas. But as a whole, it tells a story. And the story that needs to be told is, let's look at things that can practically improve patients' lives today, rather than an experimental program that really has provided no savings and no benefit for patients to date. And so with that, I would like to thank my panelists, and it's just a pleasure to see both of you again and to be able to work with both of you. And also thank our audience. Thank you for attending with us today. If you have any follow-up questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to the RAAP staff. We will get them to our panelists if there are questions that need to be followed up on, and we look forward to that interaction. And we look forward to interacting with many of you over the coming months as we prepare for 2025. So thank you. And with that, we can adjourn.